Every legal encounter leaves a trace. Every strict investigation pursues honesty. Comprehending your legal rights, establishing true justice.
You need to leave, now.
What? I'm just having coffee.
Manager says you're making people uncomfortable, you're trespassing.
I bought this coffee 10 minutes ago. I'm not bothering anyone.
Are you leaving or do I need to remove you?
You're making a mistake. FBI, Special
I don't
Agent
care
Monroe.
if you're the president, you're leaving.
She was sitting outside a coffee shop on a sunny afternoon, with a coffee on the table and her phone beside it, doing absolutely nothing wrong. Her arms were crossed not out of aggression, but with the specific posture of someone who has already understood what is happening and decided they are not going to pretend everything is fine. The expression on her face was not one of fear. It was the expression of someone who recognizes a situation they have seen before, who knows exactly what is being communicated by the simple fact of having been approached, and who is making a very precise calculation about how to respond. The camera of whoever was on the other side of the scene kept recording, and that recording would become, in the weeks that followed, the central document of a process that would cost an officer the career he had built over years. What had happened before that moment at the coffee shop was simple and common in the way certain things are common without ever being acceptable. A black woman had arrived at that cafe, had ordered her drink, had chosen an outdoor table where the sun was warm and the street noise created the kind of background sound that makes a public place paradoxically conducive to concentration. She had opened her phone, had begun working, and had stayed there like any other customer that afternoon. She had done nothing that drew attention. She had caused no disturbance of any kind. She had simply existed in that space in the most ordinary way possible. And that, for reasons the officer who approached her was never able to articulate convincingly, had been enough for someone to decide she needed to be questioned. The woman sitting at that table was named Agent Sandra Cole. She had 13 years of service with the FBI, had spent a significant portion of that time in operations that required the kind of training most people will never need, and was at that specific coffee shop on that specific afternoon because the regional field office was 4 blocks away, and that place had become, over the preceding months, an informal extension of her workspace. She knew the staff by name. They knew her order. It was the kind of place where a person becomes a regular without that requiring any explanation or justification beyond returning frequently enough. But none of that was visible to whoever arrived that afternoon, looking at her with that specific energy of someone who had decided there was a problem before having any evidence that there was one. The officer who approached Sandra's table worked in a patrol unit that covered that commercial stretch of the city. He had received, according to the account he would give later, a call from a coffee shop employee reporting a customer who was causing discomfort. That account was never substantiated by any concrete evidence. No call record, no employee statement corroborating the version that there had been any kind of disturbance before the police arrived. What existed was an officer who had arrived at a coffee shop, had seen Sandra sitting outside, and had made a decision about that scene before exchanging a single word with her. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. This story has more layers than appear in the first few minutes, and what it reveals about how certain assumptions function in practice will stay with you long after you finish watching. Hit subscribe right now and tell me in the comments. Have you ever been treated as a suspect in a place where you were a customer? Tell me down below. The camera that recorded that scene at the coffee shop was not a security camera installed in the establishment. It was Sandra's phone, which she had begun recording a few seconds after realizing what was happening, with the quiet efficiency of someone who understands that documentation is protection. That recording, made on a device that was sitting on that table next to the coffee she had purchased like any other customer, captured every second of what happened next. And what happened next revealed, with a clarity that no verbal account could fully replicate, that the officer who had arrived at that coffee shop that afternoon had made a mistake that the camera would make impossible to undo. Sandra had arrived at that coffee shop at 2:17 in the afternoon, according to the purchase record in the loyalty application she regularly used at that establishment. That detail, which would seem irrelevant under any other circumstance, would become part of the evidence record that the attorneys assembled in the weeks that followed, because it documented with time-stamp precision that she had arrived as a customer, had purchased a drink, and had occupied an outdoor table in the same way that any other person does when they choose to sit in the sun on a mild winter afternoon. She had worked for just over 40 minutes before the officer appeared. 40 minutes during which no employee had approached her to complain about anything. No other customer had shown any kind of discomfort, and the afternoon had continued with that quiet normalcy of places where nothing extraordinary is happening. The officer's name was Officer Dennis Hartley. He had 11 years of service, had received several commendations over the course of his career for quick responses in risk situations, and had also accumulated 3 formal complaints in the last 4 years, none of which had resulted in significant disciplinary consequences. That history, which would only become relevant after Sandra's case came to light, painted the portrait of someone the system had repeatedly protected from the consequences of his own actions, the kind of institutional protection that exists in silence until a case with sufficiently clear evidence makes that silence unsustainable. Hartley had arrived at the coffee shop without sirens, had parked the patrol car on the side of the parking lot, and had walked to the outdoor area with the posture of someone evaluating a situation they had already classified before arriving. When Hartley approached Sandra's table, she had already noticed his presence. This is one of the things that field training in federal agencies produces almost inevitably, a constant, peripheral awareness of the immediate environment that does not switch off when you are not on duty. Sandra had seen Hartley park, had seen his trajectory toward the outdoor area, and had picked up her phone and begun recording before he reached the table, with a naturalness the camera captured as the gesture of someone who is not afraid, but who understands that what is about to happen needs to be documented. That decision, made in less than 10 seconds, would be the one that mattered most in the end. Hartley reached the table and asked Sandra to identify herself and explain what she was doing there. There was no greeting, none of the conversational openings that transform a police approach into an interaction between human beings rather than an interrogation. There was only the direct demand, delivered in the tone of someone accustomed to that demand being met without question. Sandra responded calmly that she was a customer of the establishment, that she had purchased a drink, and that she was working. She pointed to the cup on the table as evidence of the first point, and to her phone as evidence of the second. It was a complete, truthful response that should have ended that interaction right there. But Hartley did not move. What followed was a conversation that lasted just over 8 minutes and that Sandra's camera captured in its entirety. Hartley kept pressing, asking for identification documents, questioning why she was at that specific table, asking how long she intended to stay. Each question had that characteristic structure of approaches that have no legal justification, but that sustain themselves on the premise that the person on the other side will yield out of discomfort or fear before the lack of justification needs to be explained. Sandra did not yield. She answered each question with the economical precision of someone who knows the law well enough to know exactly what she is required to answer and what she is not, and who has no intention of providing more information than strictly necessary to someone with no legal basis for asking those questions. It was at some point during that stretch of the conversation that Sandra mentioned for the first time that she was a federal agent. She did not say it as a threat or as an attempt to intimidate Hartley. She said it as relevant information, the way someone provides context, when context can change the trajectory of a situation, developing unnecessarily. Hartley's reaction to that information was captured by the camera with a clarity that Sandra's attorneys would later describe as the most revealing moment of the entire recording, because he did not back down, did not apologize, did not do any of the things most people would do upon discovering they had approached a federal agent without justification. He asked her to prove what she had said, and when Sandra began reaching for the wallet where she kept her FBI credentials, Hartley asked her to stand up from the chair. Sandra stood up from the chair with a deliberate slowness that the camera captured as the movement of someone being absolutely careful with every gesture, because they understand that anything can be misinterpreted, and that the recording is the only objective record of what is happening. She had spent 13 years in an agency that trains its agents extensively on how to behave in risk situations, on how to maintain composure when pressure is at its maximum, and on how never to give the person on the other side any element that can be used to justify an escalation. That training was working in that moment in a way that Hartley had clearly not anticipated, because Sandra was doing something that unbalanced him without her needing to raise her voice or make a single abrupt movement. She was being completely, absolutely, undeniably cooperative within the exact limits of what the law required, and within those limits, there was nothing he could use. When Sandra presented her FBI credentials, the camera captured the moment Hartley examined them. He held the document in his hands long enough to read what was written, verify the photo, and process what it meant. That interval lasted perhaps 15 seconds in the recording, and those 15 seconds would be analyzed repeatedly by Sandra's legal team in the weeks that followed, because what happened after them revealed something about Hartley that went beyond that specific incident. A person who had approached someone without justification and then discovered they were approaching a federal agent would, in most reasonable scenarios, have acknowledged the mistake and ended the interaction. Hartley did not do that. He returned the credentials and said he still needed Sandra to leave the establishment because he had received a complaint about her. That moment was the point at which the recording became something more than a record of harassment. It became the record of a decision made with full knowledge of who was on the other side, which fundamentally changed the nature of what was being documented. Until the moment Hartley saw the credentials, there was the possibility, however small, of arguing that he simply did not know who he was dealing with, and that the error was the result of incomplete information. After he saw the credentials and continued, that possibility disappeared completely. What the camera captured from that point forward was no longer an officer acting out of ignorance. It was an officer acting by choice, with complete information, in a direction that the recorded evidence would make very difficult to defend. Sandra asked for Hartley's name and identification number with the same calm she had maintained throughout the entire interaction. He provided the information with a hesitation the camera recorded, not as a dramatic pause, but as the kind of hesitation that exists when someone is beginning to realize, too late, that the situation is not going in the direction they had imagined. Sandra noted the information on her phone without rushing any movement, carefully folded the paper napkin that was on the table, disposed of her coffee in the nearest trash can, put her phone in her jacket pocket without ending the recording, and left the coffee shop with the posture of someone who was not retreating, but who was simply choosing the battlefield more carefully than that parking lot allowed. The camera kept recording inside the pocket for a few more seconds, capturing only ambient sound, and then was ended. What happened in the hours following that exit from the coffee shop moved with a speed that Hartley had certainly not calculated when he asked Sandra to stand up from the chair. She arrived at the FBI field office 4 blocks away, went directly to her supervisor, and reported the incident with the same clinical precision with which she had answered Hartley's questions. She had left the coffee shop, but had brought with her every second of that interaction, recorded in a video file that was now being transferred from her phone to the office's secure server. The supervisor listened to the account, watched the recording, and immediately did 2 things. The first was to contact the police department with formal notification of the incident. The second was to forward the file to the FBI's legal department, which had specific protocols for situations involving harassment of federal agents on or off duty. The formal notification reached the police department that same afternoon, signed with the FBI's official letterhead and containing a detailed description of the incident, Hartley's name and identification number as provided by him during the interaction, and a copy of the recording Sandra had made. The department chief received that document at 5:43 in the afternoon, according to the official correspondence entry log. He had left before any response was formulated, but members of his team who saw the document that afternoon described the reaction as the kind of silence that settles when everyone in a room simultaneously understands that something is about to become very complicated. The recording had reached the department, and the recording left no room for any alternative version of what had happened at that coffee shop that afternoon. The internal investigation was opened the following morning, 48 hours earlier than the department's standard protocol would normally require. That speed was not the result of a genuine impulse toward transparency. It was the result of a call the department chief had received early that morning from a representative of the FBI's regional field office who had been very clear about the level of institutional attention the case was receiving and about the expectations regarding the speed of the response. When a federal agency calls a municipal police department in that specific tone, internal priorities reorganize in a way that purely internal processes rarely produce. The investigation was opened. A senior investigator was assigned, and Hartley was notified that same morning that he was under investigation and that he should appear for a formal interview that afternoon. Hartley's interview lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. He arrived accompanied by a police union representative, which was his right and was also a clear signal that he understood the gravity of what he was facing. His version of events followed the structure that defense versions in cases like this tend to follow. He had received a complaint, had responded professionally, had asked for identification in a standard manner, and had requested that the customer leave the establishment after verifying that there was a dispute between her and the coffee shop management. Each of those points had a fundamental problem, and the problem was the same in every case. The recording showed something different, not different in interpretation, not different depending on angle or context. Different in the facts, the sequence, and the words used. The investigator assigned to the case was a man named Lieutenant Morrison, with 23 years of service and a reputation within the department for being the kind of professional who does not shape investigation conclusions to protect colleagues. When the evidence points in an inconvenient direction, he had watched Sandra's recording 3 times before Hartley's interview, had noted the timestamps of every relevant moment, and had formulated specific questions about each point where Hartley's version diverged from what the camera showed. When those questions were asked during the interview, Hartley's inability to respond consistently with the recording was documented in the interview record itself, creating a second evidence file that added to the first without either party needing to make any additional argument. The facts were contradicting themselves on their own. The police department had requested, through the appropriate formal channels, access to the call records from the day of the incident to verify whether any call had actually been made from the coffee shop reporting a disruptive customer. The result of that inquiry arrived 2 days after Hartley's interview and was the kind of information that, when it arrives, drastically simplifies the analysis of a case that until then could have been characterized as word against word. There was no record of any call from the coffee shop to the emergency number or to any police line that day in the period before Hartley's arrival. There was no record of any internal communication in the department's system documenting the receipt of a complaint before the approach. The complaint that had justified the entire operation simply did not exist in any verifiable record. That detail transformed the case in a fundamental way. Until that point, there was the theoretical possibility that Hartley had acted on genuine information, even if misinterpreted or exaggerated. The absence of any complaint record eliminated that possibility and placed a far more serious question at the center of the investigation. What had motivated the approach if there was no real complaint? The most obvious answer, and the one the recording supported visually in a fairly clear manner, was that Hartley had seen Sandra sitting outside the coffee shop and had made a decision about that scene based on something that was not a complaint, was not an observable behavior justifying intervention, and was not any of the objective criteria that should guide a police approach. It was an assumption, and that assumption had very specific characteristics that the investigation was now formally documenting. The police union entered Hartley's defense with full force as soon as the scope of the investigation began to become clear. Union representatives made public statements about the department's commitment to protecting its members, about the importance of ensuring that investigations were conducted without external political pressure, and about the risk that the FBI's presence as an interested party in the case compromised the impartiality of the process. Those statements were the kind of defensive move that police unions execute with precision when they realize the evidence is not on the side of the member they are protecting, and that the only available ground is procedural ground. There was no argument about the facts because the facts were recorded. There were only arguments about how the facts should be treated, and those arguments were being made in an increasingly urgent tone that communicated, to anyone paying attention, that the union knew Hartley's position was far more fragile than the public statement suggested. The civil lawsuit was filed 6 weeks after the incident, at a moment deliberately chosen by Sandra's legal team to maximize the impact of what was being presented. The department's internal investigation was still formally ongoing, which meant the civil lawsuit reached the public sphere before the department had had the opportunity to produce any conclusion that could be used to frame the narrative favorably for the institution. That sequence had been calculated. Sandra and her attorneys had understood from the beginning that one of their most important assets was control over timing, and that using that control intelligently was as important as the quality of the evidence itself, which was already considerable. The lawsuit named Hartley individually, and the department as an institution, and the allegations were constructed in layers that reinforced each other in a way that made each one harder to refute than it would have been in isolation. The first layer was the most direct: discriminatory harassment based on race. Documented by the recording, that showed an approach without objective justification against a customer who was exercising a right that any other customer present at that coffee shop that afternoon was exercising without any intervention. The second layer was more specific and more serious from the standpoint of potential consequences. Interference with a federal agent in the exercise of her duties. Because Sandra was not merely off-duty that afternoon, she was, as the recording and context made clear, in a period between work engagements, and the coffee shop was functionally part of her operational environment, given that the office was 4 blocks away. The third layer was the one the department's attorneys feared most, because it was the one that transformed Hartley's individual case into an institutional matter of far greater magnitude. That allegation argued that the documented history of 3 prior complaints against Hartley, none of which had resulted in real disciplinary consequences, established a pattern of behavior that the department had systematically ignored, and that pattern of supervisory negligence created direct institutional liability for what had happened at that coffee shop. In legal language, that argument has a specific name, and when supported with sufficient evidence, it represents one of the most solid pathways to establishing an institution's responsibility for the acts of its members that go beyond what a single agent acting alone could create. The department's attorneys responded to the lawsuit with unusual speed, which was itself an indicator of the level of internal concern. They argued qualified immunity for Hartley, operational discretion to justify the approach, and attempted to frame the history of prior complaints as evidence of a system functioning correctly rather than of a system failing to hold a problematic agent accountable. Each of those arguments had a prepared response from Sandra's attorneys, and the responses had been prepared in advance because the arguments were predictable. When you know the history of how police departments respond to civil lawsuits with video evidence, you know 3 to 4 moves in advance what the defense will present, and you prepare the responses before the arguments are made. The recording was the center of everything throughout the preliminary proceedings. It was presented at every hearing as primary evidence, and each time the department attempted to create distance between Hartley and the allegations using abstract language about procedure and operational discretion, Sandra's attorneys returned to the video. Specific frame, specific timestamp, specific observable behavior that contradicts the abstract allegation being made. That strategy of anchoring each abstract legal argument in a concrete and verifiable moment from the recording was described by legal observers following the case as one of the most methodically effective approaches they had seen in similar cases, because it made it virtually impossible for any judge or jury to separate the legal arguments from the visual evidence that supported or refuted them. The pressure the case was generating outside the courtroom ran parallel to the pressure being built inside it. Civil rights organizations had formally endorsed Sandra's position. Groups of federal agents from racial minorities had issued statements about the broader pattern the case represented. Investigative journalists had begun researching Hartley's full history and the 3 prior complaints the department had filed without consequences, and the results of that research were beginning to appear in publications the department could not ignore. The police union had escalated its defense rhetoric to a level that was creating its own public relations problem, because the intensity of defending an agent whose actions were recorded on video communicated something about the institutions, priorities that many people were noticing and commenting on. The department was being pressured from every direction simultaneously, and every week that passed without a resolution made the position harder to sustain. The agreement was announced on a Thursday morning, 4 months after that afternoon at the coffee shop. The document was 21 pages long and had been negotiated over 6 weeks of conversations that, according to sources close to the proceedings, had been significantly more tense than typical agreements of this kind tend to be, because the department had entered the negotiations still trying to preserve Hartley's job through some combination of suspension, demotion, or transfer that would allow the outcome to be called accountability without having to reach dismissal. Sandra had rejected each of those configurations with the same consistency with which she had answered Hartley's questions at that coffee shop, within the exact limits of what she considered acceptable, and with no willingness to move those limits to facilitate an exit that did not reflect the real weight of what had been done. Hartley was dismissed as a condition of the agreement, not transferred, not suspended for a fixed period, not demoted to an administrative role where he would continue receiving a salary while the case cooled in public memory. dismissed, with loss of the police certification he had accumulated over 11 years, which in practice ended any possibility of continuing a career in law enforcement in any jurisdiction with access to the state certification record. The union attempted to reverse that condition until the last possible moment of the negotiations, arguing that dismissal was disproportionate for a first formal incident. Sandra's attorneys responded that the 3 prior complaints filed without consequences made that incident the 4th in a pattern, not the first in an isolated deviation, and that the agreement should reflect the complete pattern and not only the episode that had finally been documented with sufficient evidence to not be ignored. The financial value of the agreement was kept confidential by a negotiated clause, but the institutional conditions were made public as part of a requirement Sandra had insisted be included. She had argued through her attorneys that agreements closed entirely in secrecy serve primarily the interest of the institution that erred because they allow the payment to be treated as an operational cost without any real change in the behaviors that produced the error. Making the institutional conditions public was a way of creating accountability that survived the agreement itself, that existed as a verifiable record independently of any interest the department might have in minimizing what had happened after public attention shifted to another case. The institutional conditions included a complete revision of the approach protocol in public commercial spaces with documented objective criteria that needed to be satisfied before any intervention based on a third-party complaint. They also included the creation of a complaint tracking system for individual agents that generated automatic alerts when an agent accumulated more than 2 complaints within a 4-year period, with mandatory supervisory review before the agent could continue in operational roles without additional evaluation. And they included specific training on interactions with agents from other public safety agencies, federal or state, with emphasis on identification and verification protocols that should be activated immediately when an agent identifies themselves as federal during an approach. Sandra gave a single interview after the agreement was finalized to the news outlet that had covered the case with the most depth from the beginning. She spoke for less than 15 minutes, without notes, and what she said was remarkable, not for its intensity, but for its precision. She did not describe the agreement as a personal victory. She described it as a data point in a much larger set that still needed many more points before any optimistic conclusion about systemic change could be sustained. She said she had recorded that interaction at the coffee shop because she had learned, over 13 years of service in a federal agency, that documentation is the only protection that works consistently when the other protective structures fail. And she said she had fought until a dismissal and not until a suspension, because suspensions end and then the person comes back, and the person who comes back is the same person who was—
Hold on. Did you just take that out of my cart?
The shelf was empty. I need this more than you do.
That's not how this works. Put it back.
I'm not putting it back. First come, first serve, right? You hadn't even paid for it yet.
Wow, you can't just steal from people because you feel like you need it more.
Watch me.
She had just gotten off work. Her jacket was still on, her car keys still in her pocket, and the shopping list she had written on her phone during lunch was open on the screen while she pushed the cart through the supermarket aisles with that specific efficiency of a mother who knows exactly what she needs, knows where it is, and has a limited window of time before she needs to be home. It was an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of Tuesday that should produce no memory worth telling, no moment that stands out from the other days of the week. And then she turned into the cereal aisle, stopped the cart, and when she looked back at it after reaching for something on the shelf, there was a blonde woman on the other side of the aisle holding a box that had come from her cart, with the naturalness of someone picking up something that belongs to them. The supermarket security camera was recording. It always records. That is what it exists for, capturing in a continuous loop every aisle, every interaction, every ordinary and extraordinary moment that happens between the shelves of a commercial establishment open to the public. On that specific afternoon, in the cereal aisle, it captured something that the employees who reviewed the footage later described as one of the most disconcerting interactions they had seen in years of working at that supermarket. Not because there was violence, not because there were shouts or physical confrontation, but because what was happening in those images was so clearly wrong and so clearly recorded that watching it produced in the viewer the kind of discomfort that comes from seeing someone being treated unfairly without anything in the surrounding environment seeming to notice. The woman with the cart was named Danielle. She was 34 years old, had spent the entire day working as a pediatric speech therapist at a health center that served children with communication difficulties, and was at that specific supermarket because it was on the way between work and home, and because her son, who was 6 years old, had asked that morning for the yellow box cereal he liked that had run out in the pantry. That cereal was now in the hands of the other woman. The blonde woman in the beige sweater, who had crossed the aisle, reached into Danielle's cart, removed the box, and was now holding it with an expression the camera captured as the expression of someone who does not understand why they are being questioned about something they consider completely natural. What had motivated that gesture was something the blonde woman, whose name the subsequent investigation would reveal to be Christina, would try to explain in different ways at different moments in the weeks that followed, and each explanation would be less convincing than the one before it, because none of them could answer the simplest question the video posed. Why did you take something from another person's cart? Christina was, according to her own social media, profiles that would become public knowledge after the case went viral, a lifestyle consultant, the kind of occupation that exists in the space between digital influencer and wellness coach. And that depends on a personal brand built around images of an organized, healthy, and aspirational life. What she had done in that cereal aisle was not consistent with any of those images, and the camera had captured every second of the inconsistency. Before we continue, if this is your first time on this channel, welcome. This story has an ending that Christina certainly had not calculated when she walked into that supermarket that afternoon, and you are going to want to follow every section to the end. Hit subscribe right now and tell me in the comments, have you ever seen someone treated this way in a public place and not known what to do? Tell me down below. Danielle looked at Christina with that expression the camera captured in detail, and that anyone who has ever been on the wrong side of an unfair situation immediately recognizes. It was not anger. It was the kind of calm astonishment that precedes anger when you are still in the process of confirming that what you are seeing is really what it appears to be. She pointed to the box in Christina's hands. Christina looked at the box, looked at the cart, looked at Danielle, and said something the camera recorded, but that the security system's audio did not capture clearly enough to be transcribed. What the camera captured with sufficient clarity was what happened next, and what happened next was the beginning of something that neither Danielle nor Christina would finish that week the same way they had started it. Danielle had arrived at that supermarket at 5:34 in the afternoon that day, tired in the specific way that a full day working with young children produces, which is different from physical fatigue and different from intellectual fatigue, and has a quality of its own that only someone who has spent years in a pediatric environment can describe precisely. She had seen 11 children that day, had conducted 3 language development assessment sessions, had had 2 meetings with parents and 1 with the center's multidisciplinary team, and had left work with that familiar feeling of having given the maximum available in those hours, and that what remained now was the time that belonged to her and her son. That time began with the shopping list and ended with the dinner she had already decided to make while driving to the supermarket. The cereal aisle was third on the list. She had picked up items from the first 2 aisles without incident, had waved to an employee she knew from shopping there every week, and had entered the cereal aisle with the cart already partially full, and her attention divided between the shelf in front of her and her phone, where there was a message from her son asking what time she would be home. She had paused the cart, had replied to the message, had looked up to locate the yellow box cereal on the shelf, and had turned to reach for it. That turning motion lasted perhaps 15 seconds. When she brought her attention back to the cart, Christina was already there. Christina had entered the aisle from the opposite end. The security camera showed her arriving with a shopping basket on her arm, no cart, and moving along the shelves with the posture of someone looking for something specific. When she passed Danielle's cart, which was stopped in the middle of the aisle, while Danielle reached for the shelf, the camera showed something that was simultaneously simple and absolutely disconcerting. Christina stopped, looked at the cart, looked at the surrounding shelves, and then extended her hand and removed the cereal box that was in Danielle's cart, with a movement so casual and so devoid of hesitation that it appeared not to have crossed her mind for a single second that this was someone else's cart, and that what she was doing was removing an item that did not belong to her. Danielle saw it happen at the moment she was turning with the cereal from the shelf in her hand. She stopped for a second, processing what she had just seen, and then did the most reasonable thing any person would do in that situation. She asked directly but without raising her voice whether Christina had just removed that item from her cart. The question was recorded in the camera's audio clearly enough to be understood, and Christina's reaction to that question was what the camera captured and what anyone who watched the video described as the moment it became clear that this situation was not an innocent confusion that would be resolved in 10 seconds, with an apology and the return of the box. Christina did not return the box. She looked at Danielle with that expression the camera had captured, the expression of someone who does not understand why they are being questioned, and began to speak. The security system's audio captured enough fragments of that conversation for the attorneys who worked on the case afterward to reconstruct the substance of what had been said, even without a complete transcript. What Christina had communicated, in words that varied throughout that conversation, but that converged on a consistent central point, was that she had taken the box because she wanted that specific cereal, and there had been only one on the shelf, and that one was in Danielle's cart. She had said this not as someone who had just realized they did something wrong and is trying to explain a lapse in judgment. She had said it as someone who considers the logic of what they did sufficiently reasonable to require no more explanation than that logic, that Christina had taken the cereal from Danielle's cart simply because she wanted it, and because there was only one available, was so devoid of any consideration for Danielle's perspective as a person with equal rights over the products in that supermarket, that Danielle stood looking at her for a moment without immediately knowing how to respond. Not because she did not know what to say, but because the obvious response was so obvious that having to say it out loud in a conversation with an adult generated a specific kind of fatigue that goes beyond simple disagreement. She knew that fatigue. It was the fatigue of having to explain that you have the same right to be in a place that everyone around you assumes is guaranteed for themselves. And recognizing that fatigue in that supermarket aisle on a Tuesday afternoon, after a full day of work, was the moment Danielle decided she was not simply going to let it go. The conversation between the two women in that aisle lasted just over 3 minutes, according to the security camera's timestamp. 3 minutes that the recording captured at a sufficiently clear angle to show the body language of both, the position of the cereal box that remained in Christina's hands throughout the entire interaction, and the exact moment a supermarket employee entered the aisle, drawn by the elevated tone of the conversation. That employee, a young woman in a green uniform, who the camera showed arriving from the back of the aisle with the expression of someone not yet sure what they are walking into, would become one of the most important witnesses to everything that developed from that point forward, not because she had seen the beginning, but because she had arrived early enough to see enough. Christina had constructed during those 3 minutes a narrative that changed shape each time Danielle presented a direct counter-argument. First, there had been the logic of scarcity. There was only one box available, and she needed that specific cereal for a recipe she was making that week. When Danielle pointed out that the fact that there was only one box was precisely the reason she had placed that box in her own cart before Christina arrived in the aisle, the narrative shifted. Christina began suggesting that perhaps Danielle did not really need that specific cereal, that there were other options on the surrounding shelves that would be equally suitable, and that it would be much simpler if Danielle simply chose an alternative. That suggestion, that Danielle should surrender the item from her cart and choose an alternative as though Christina's convenience were a legitimate consideration in that equation, was the moment the employee who had entered the aisle understood that what she was witnessing was not a cart mix-up resolvable with friendly mediation. Danielle asked for the box to be returned directly and without detours. Christina did not return it. Instead, she did something the camera captured, and that would become one of the most discussed elements when the video circulated publicly. She turned slightly and placed the box in her own shopping basket with a movement that communicated closure, as though the matter were resolved by the simple action of putting the item away. It was the kind of gesture that only makes sense when the person making it assumes the other person will accept the conclusion implicit in it. Danielle did not accept it. She extended her hand toward Christina's basket with the clear intention of removing the box that was hers, and Christina stepped back, which was the moment the employee decided to intervene and asked both of them to accompany her to customer service. What happened on the way to customer service was captured by 2 more security cameras positioned in the aisles through which the 3 women passed, and that additional material completed the timeline in a way that made it impossible to argue there was any ambiguity about what had occurred in the cereal aisle. Christina continued with the basket, Danielle's cereal box was still inside it, and Danielle walked beside the employee with that specific posture of someone containing a reaction proportional to what they are feeling, because they know the space they are in is not the appropriate space for that reaction, and because they also know they are being observed, and that how they behave in that moment will matter later in ways that are not yet fully predictable. That self-control, visible in every frame of those additional cameras, was the practical expression of a kind of awareness that Black people carry in public spaces, and that has a cost that appears in no recording but is absolutely real. At the customer service counter, the situation was presented to a store supervisor named Marcus, who was 32 years old and had 6 years of experience at that specific supermarket, and who listened to both versions with the expression of someone who has mediated enough customer disagreements to quickly recognize when he is facing something that is not a simple misunderstanding. Danielle presented the situation factually and sequentially. Christina presented a version that had evolved once more since the aisle, now including the suggestion that there had been a confusion about which cart belonged to whom, a narrative that the security footage made completely unsustainable, but that Christina presented with the confidence of someone who had not stopped to consider that there were cameras in the cereal aisle that had recorded every second of it. Marcus excused himself, went to the back office, and watched the relevant recording in less than 4 minutes. When he returned, his posture had changed in a perceptible way. Marcus asked that the cereal box be returned to Danielle immediately, offered a formal apology on behalf of the establishment for what had occurred, and informed Christina that the supermarket's general manager would be notified of the incident, and that depending on the assessment of that notification, she might be prevented from returning to the establishment. Christina heard this with an expression the customer service counter camera captured, and that was noticeably different from the expression she had carried throughout the entire interaction in the cereal aisle. It was the expression of someone who was beginning to understand, with a considerable delay relative to the moment when that understanding would have been useful, that the assumptions she had brought to that supermarket that afternoon were not assumptions the surrounding world was willing to validate in the way she had presumed they would be. The camera recorded that moment with the same indifference with which it had recorded all the others. It did not know what that moment would mean in the weeks that followed, but it was all there, preserved in high definition, waiting to be found. Danielle left the supermarket that afternoon with the yellow box cereal in her cart, and with something more she had not planned to take home, the absolute clarity that she was not going to let it pass. She had lived enough, had worked enough in environments where she needed to repeatedly prove competence to people who underestimated her before she opened her mouth, and had accumulated enough of that specific kind of fatigue that does not come from work, but from navigating a world that frequently treats her presence as something that needs to be justified. She knew how to recognize that fatigue, and she also knew, with the same clarity with which she recognized language development patterns in the children she treated, that ignoring what had happened in that cereal aisle was a way of saying it was acceptable. She did not believe it was acceptable, and she had the recording to prove she had reason not to believe it. The first call she made was still in the supermarket parking lot to her older sister, who was a legal assistant at a civil law firm, and who listened to the complete account in silence before asking one simple and direct question. Did the supermarket have security cameras in the cereal aisle? Danielle confirmed it did. There were cameras in practically every aisle of that establishment, and she had seen Supervisor Marcus go review the footage before returning the box and apologizing. Her sister paused briefly and then said that Danielle needed to formally request access to that recording before the system's automatic archiving cycle overrode it, which in medium-sized supermarkets normally happened between 48 and 72 hours after the recording was made. Danielle hung up the phone, went back into the supermarket, and asked to speak with the general manager. The general manager's name was Robert. He had been notified of the incident by Marcus before Danielle returned, and when she arrived at his office, he had already watched the recording. From the cereal aisle and the recording from the customer service counter, he was a 51-year-old man with 23 years of experience in the retail sector and with the capacity developed over that time to quickly identify when a situation had the potential to become something larger than a disagreement between customers. What he had seen in the recordings was unambiguous, and he knew that what Danielle was about to request was not only reasonable, but was the kind of request that any establishment with a sense of responsibility should grant without hesitation. Robert assured Danielle that the recording would be preserved and that she would receive a copy in an appropriate format upon formal written request, which he himself would prepare and date at that moment if she wished. She did. The document was prepared right there, with the date and time of that conversation, confirming that the supermarket acknowledged what had occurred, that there was video evidence of the incident, and that evidence would be made available to Danielle through the appropriate legal procedures. Robert also confirmed, in response to a direct question from Danielle, that Christina was a registered customer in the supermarket's loyalty program and that access to the establishment could be suspended depending on the internal assessment of the incident. That detail, that Christina had a registered account and that there was a record of her information in the supermarket system, was information that Danielle's attorneys would use in the weeks that followed, in a way that Robert had probably not fully anticipated when he mentioned it. The decision to seek legal counsel was made that same evening after Danielle put her son to bed and sat in the kitchen, processing what had happened with the distance of a few hours and the silence that the end of the day allows. She had narrated the incident to her son in a way adapted for a 6-year-old, without the heavier details, but enough to explain why his mother had arrived a little later than promised, and why she had an expression that he had noticed and asked about, with the direct perception of young children. That conversation with her son, more than anything else that afternoon, had crystallized something. She was raising a black son in a world that had just demonstrated, once again, that the presence of black people in public spaces was treated as conditional in ways that the presence of other people was not. And she did not want the response she taught her son to be simply to let it go. The attorney she consulted 2 days after the incident specialized in discrimination cases at commercial establishments and had conducted similar proceedings before, none with video evidence as clear as what Danielle had secured through the document signed by Robert. When he watched the recording for the first time, his assessment was immediate and direct. The video showed a sequence of events that supported multiple legal allegations with direct evidence, without the need for inference or interpretation. There was the unauthorized removal of the item from the cart, documented at an angle and clarity that left no room for Christina's alternative version about cart confusion. There was the refusal to return the item after being confronted by the owner, documented in the same way. And there was Christina's behavior at the customer service counter, where she had presented a version of events that the recording directly contradicted, which added an additional layer of legal relevance to the material Danielle had preserved. The lawsuit was constructed over 3 weeks with a methodology that reflected both the clarity of the available evidence and the attorney's experience in cases where the opposing party tends to minimize what happened until the evidence makes minimization impossible to sustain. The central strategy was simple in its structure, but required precision in execution, presenting each allegation anchored in a specific and verifiable moment from the recording, in a way that any attempt by Christina to offer an alternative version of events would have to confront directly images that contradicted that version objectively and irrefutably. There was no room for subjective interpretation when the camera had captured every gesture, every movement, every second of the sequence that led from the cereal aisle to the customer service counter. The allegations were structured in 3 layers that reinforced each other progressively. The first was the most direct and the easiest to establish with the available evidence, unauthorized appropriation of personal property, because the cereal box was in Danielle's cart before any interaction between the 2 women, and the camera showed Christina removing that item without any request, without any authorization, and without any indication that she had confused the cart with her own because she did not have a cart. That point, that Christina had arrived in the aisle with a shopping basket on her arm and not with a cart that could have caused genuine confusion, was one of the elements the camera angle captured with enough clarity to be established as fact, without the need for any other corroboration. The second layer was more complex and more significant in terms of what the lawsuit was attempting to establish beyond the immediate incident. Danielle's attorney had researched Christina's public history carefully enough to identify a pattern that, although no prior incident had reached legal proceedings, was documentable through public records and statements from people who had had interactions with her in commercial spaces. There was a complaint filed at a coffee shop in the same area. There was a documented account in an online consumer group about an incident at an organic market. And there were at least 2 other people who, after the supermarket video began circulating, contacted Danielle's attorney spontaneously to report similar experiences. None of those cases had involved cameras. None had resulted in consequences. Danielle's case was different in both respects. The third layer was the one that most concerned Christina's attorney, who had been retained 2 days after she received formal notification of the lawsuit and who had requested access to the recording as a first step, probably expecting to find something that could be reinterpreted in a way favorable to his client. What he found when he watched the video was what anyone who watched it found: a sequence of events without ambiguity, captured at an angle and quality sufficient for each allegation in the lawsuit to have direct and verifiable visual correspondence. That third layer argued that Christina's behavior at the supermarket, considered together with the documented pattern of prior incidents and the specific nature of how she had treated Danielle, in contrast to how she had interacted with other customers visible in the recording, constituted racial discrimination in a public space. The kind of allegation that, in a legal context, requires evidence of pattern beyond the isolated incident, and that the lawsuit was building precisely that pattern with the pieces the research had assembled. Christina had a public presence as a lifestyle consultant, which meant the lawsuit and the evidence accompanying it did not exist only in the legal record, but also in the digital space where her personal brand had been built. When the supermarket video became public knowledge, which happened gradually but inevitably as the lawsuit progressed, and journalists covering discrimination cases in commercial spaces began making requests to access the recording, the reaction on the platforms where Christina had a presence was immediate and intense. The people who followed her as a lifestyle consultant were now watching the video that showed her removing an item from another woman's cart and refusing to return it. And the dissonance between the public persona she had built and the behavior documented on the supermarket security camera was large enough to produce the kind of reaction that digital platforms amplify with an efficiency that no crisis communication strategy can fully neutralize when the video evidence is that clear. Brands and commercial partners who had worked with Christina in her influencer capacity began distancing themselves with a speed that revealed how contingent those partnerships had been on the maintenance of an image that the video had compromised in a way that could not be reframed. 2 sponsors terminated. Active contracts within a week of the video becoming widely accessible. An online course platform where Christina sold wellness content removed her materials from the catalog without a public statement, the kind of silent action that communicates more about the internal assessment of the situation than any formal declaration could. Christina's attorney began receiving communications from Danielle's attorney about the possibility of a settlement simultaneously, with the period in which Christina's professional consequences were becoming clear, and that simultaneity was not accidental. It was the result of a strategy that had anticipated that the legal pressure and the reputational pressure would feed each other in a way that would make the cost of going to trial progressively higher than the cost of resolving the case through an agreement that genuinely acknowledged what had been done. The settlement negotiations began formally on a Thursday afternoon, 5 weeks after that Tuesday at the supermarket. Christina's attorney had arrived at that first meeting with a proposal that his client probably knew, at some level they were not yet able to fully articulate, would be rejected. It was the kind of initial offer that exists not because whoever presents it believes it will be accepted, but because making a low offer is the only way to test how far the other side is willing to go, without prematurely revealing how much you are willing to concede. Danielle's attorney declined without an immediate counteroffer, which communicated to the other side that Danielle's team was not in a hurry and that the passage of time was not working in Christina's favor the way it sometimes does when the party being sued has more resources and more capacity to absorb the duration of a lengthy process. The absence of urgency on Danielle's side had a logic that went beyond legal strategy. Every week that passed without an agreement was a week in which Christina's professional consequences continued accumulating in a way that the legal process alone could not produce. The platforms where she had built her presence as a lifestyle consultant were undergoing a slow but documentable process of emptying, followers disengaging, partnerships ending, the architecture of a personal brand that had taken years to build being dismantled by the weight of a 3-minute video in a supermarket aisle. Danielle had not orchestrated that process. It had happened as the natural result of available evidence meeting an audience that had the capacity to evaluate it. But the existence of that process outside the courtroom created pressure on Christina that made each subsequent round of negotiations more favorable to Danielle than the previous one. The second round of negotiations produced a substantially more serious proposal, still insufficient by the criteria Danielle had established clearly from the beginning, but different enough from the first, to confirm that Christina's side had made its own assessment of the case's trajectory and had arrived at a conclusion about where it was heading, if not resolved. Danielle's attorney responded with a counteroffer that was precise in its terms and that included, beyond a financial amount that reflected the harm caused, a set of non-financial conditions that Christina had resisted since the beginning of negotiations, but that Danielle had determined were non-negotiable. Those conditions were the core of what she had decided that night in the kitchen after putting her son to bed. And no time pressure or procedural argument had moved that determination a centimeter since then. The final agreement was signed on a Monday morning, 6 weeks and 4 days after the supermarket incident. The financial amount was kept confidential by a standard clause both sides had agreed to include, but the non-financial conditions were made partially public. Danielle's insistence, who had successfully argued that the public interest in transparency about what had been agreed, outweighed Christina's interest in having the details remain entirely private. Christina was required to complete a structured program of education on racial bias and discrimination in public spaces, with verification of completion by an independent entity and a defined deadline within which completion needed to be documented. That condition had been the most resisted by Christina's defense, probably because it was the most concrete in terms of what it required in acknowledgement, and for that same reason, it was the one Danielle had defended most firmly. Christina disappeared almost completely from the public digital space in the months that followed the agreement. The platforms where she had had an active presence were either inactive or operating with a minimal fraction of their previous engagement. The lifestyle consultant brand she had built over years had been sufficiently compromised by the video and its consequences that any reconstruction would require a degree of effort and time she was clearly still assessing how to approach. There were no public statements, no redemption narrative attempts that sometimes appear in these cases, no movement suggesting she had processed what had happened in a way that produced anything beyond an awareness that there were consequences. Whether genuine reflection was happening somewhere beyond what the public record showed, there was no way to know. What there was a way to know was that a supermarket security camera had documented a 3-minute moment that had changed the trajectory of 2 lives in ways that were very different and very asymmetric. Danielle returned to work the week after the incident, returned to the supermarket 2 weeks later because it was the closest to her home and because there was no logical reason she should change her habits because of what had happened, and continued raising her son with the same difficult and necessary conversations that Black mothers have with Black sons, about how to navigate a world that frequently treats their presence as conditional. The agreement had produced financial resources she had directed partly toward her son's education fund, and partly toward an organization that offered free legal support to people who had experienced discrimination in commercial spaces, but who did not have the resources to hire legal representation. That choice had been deliberate and had been the first she had made after the agreement was signed, because what she had learned throughout that process was that the difference between what had happened to her and what continues happening to other people without any consequence was not that she deserved more protection than they did. It was that she had had access to resources that most people do not have, and as long as that asymmetry existed, the only response that made sense was to use part of what she had, received to reduce that distance a little. What was disclosed were the non-financial conditions that James had determined were non-negotiable from the first day: Larson's dismissal without possibility of rehire in any law enforcement capacity, complete revision of protocols for interacting with people with disabilities throughout the department, and verifiable mandatory training that could not be completed on paper alone. Larson was dismissed 4 months after the incident, after the internal investigation concluded that he had violated multiple departmental protocols and that the complaint history made it impossible to treat the incident as an isolated deviation. The police union filed an appeal that was denied on second review after the external reviewer confirmed the internal investigation's findings and added his own analysis that the white cane had been visible from the first second of the body camera and that no standard training in any department in the country could be interpreted as authorizing the approach that had been made. That specific language from the external reviewer, that no standard training authorized what had been done, closed the path to any operational discretion argument the union might have attempted to construct in a higher instance. James received the item he had ordered at the musical instrument store 3 days after being released on that sidewalk, during a visit the store had arranged outside normal business hours after the employee who had answered the call that morning learned what had happened. That visit was not on any recording and was not part of any legal record. It was simply a man walking into a store with his cane and leaving with what he had gone to find. The agreement that closed the federal lawsuit was signed 6 months after the incident. The financial amount remained confidential. The institutional conditions were made public at James's insistence, who had argued that the only outcome that justified the time and energy invested was an outcome that existed as a verifiable record beyond that specific case. Larson had lost his career, the department had changed its protocols, and James had returned to that commercial street some weeks after the agreement was signed, had covered the same route he had planned on that November morning, had entered the musical instrument store for the second time, and had left with his cane in hand navigating the sidewalk with the same low rhythmic arc that anyone who saw him would immediately recognize for what it was. The same movement that had been visible on the body camera from the very first second. The movement that should never have been enough for anything other than letting him pass.
Truth is a continuous pursuit, and awareness is your best defense. Thank you for watching and championing global transparency.